Bonus Tracks is the official blog of Spotlight On, available at spotlightonpodcast.com/blog. There you'll find additional artist interviews, music commentary, and more. Have a look. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today, the spotlight shines on vocalist, composer, and improviser Ray-Chee Wong. Ray-Chee creates stunning experimental music, combining influences from jazz, contemporary Euroclassical music, and traditional Chinese music. Ray-Chee joined me earlier this year on the heels of the release of her debut album, Subduing the Silence, out through the label Orchard of Pomegranates. This profound 36-minute album boasts an all-female cast of collaborators and expresses a musical vision seldom articulated in a debut work. In addition to composing, performing, and recording in a variety of contexts and projects, Ray-Chee is pursuing a master's degree in music composition and contemporary jazz at the Bern Academy of the Arts in Switzerland. Enjoy our talk. As a way to get started, there are so many strands and traditions that seem to come together in your music. And I'm curious how you came to integrate all of that music and what the stages were of you being sort of introduced to that music throughout your life.
I actually started studying music full-time quite late. Growing up, I listened to mostly Chinese pop music and some classical music because I played classical piano growing up. But that's almost all of it before when I was like 18 or 19, when I started university. I started university in psychology, and I wasn't even aware there was a music program at my university, but I always wanted to be a musician. So when I was maybe 19, that's when I started hearing jazz and taking some private jazz voice lessons. Up to then, it was really focusing on learning jazz and the tradition. Eventually, I switched to a music major in my undergrad. That's when I started hearing more music, and I just got really interested in contemporary classical music. I took a music history class in 20th century European and American classical music, and I got really intrigued. I don't know why, maybe like it's my personality. I was just amazed by how creative those composers were. So that was like, I guess, a further development in the music I listened to. Later, like towards the end of my undergrad, I started to get curious about the music of my own tradition. So that's about maybe 2 years ago. That's when I started researching Chinese traditional music. I asked myself the same question, how do they come together? I don't know how to answer that. I think it's just my experience and knowledge I learn and the understanding I develop as I do more research and learn more about music. And I guess now music is just music for me.
Who were some of those composers that really captured you? You mentioned being very drawn to or very inspired by some modern classical composers.
It was a class with a lot of information in one semester, and I was hearing the names for the first time, like Stockhausen, Ligeti, and the minimalist composers like Steve Reich and all those people. And of course, John Cage, Messiaen.
My understanding is that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that McGill is more of a conservatory type study. I have a few questions about how you changed majors. Was the process itself difficult? Like, how does one, I would imagine you don't just walk in and change your major.
You're right, McGill. It is really like conservatory. I started just finding some professors and students at McGill in the music department who were teaching voice. I started just by taking some private lessons. My mom is really supportive, so she's like paying for all my expenses and so that I could just focus on learning. So I took both classical and jazz voice lessons, trying to figure out what I wanted to do, because all I wanted was to study music. And then I chose jazz because it felt there's more fun and I can add some of my own creative input into this type of music. So I took private lessons for about a year or so. And then I just went through the same process as the high school students who's coming in. I had to audition, and I think it's a pretty selective program. It's very competitive. First, I got into a more general music major with not that much performance opportunity. And then I tried again, and then I got into performance.
Wow. It's a very short time period to have accomplished all of those milestones. It's staggering to think about.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's just something I really wanted to do, and I just love music and I love singing, and I really wanted to make it work as my career. And I did put a lot of work into it. Yeah, but at the same time, it was a lot of information, and I'm happy that I made a lot of progress. But sometimes looking back, like right now, I'm trying to just reconnect with my love for music and just try to really not do it as school or task at all. That's what I'm trying to get back to right now. It's nice how much progress I made, but I think it was a trial and error, and sometimes I work way too much.
Most of the artists that I've spoken with who have been conservatory or just academically trained in music, I can't think of another artist I've spoken with who was a vocalist. Most were either pianists or some external instrument. What is a vocalist studying? What is the practice of being a vocalist? It seems so, it's difficult for me to imagine. It's so much easier to understand, a pianist practices piano, learns repertoire, learns technique. Is there as much to study as a vocalist as there is to an instrumentalist?
I think you're right in the sense that for vocalists, it's much more difficult to organize the practice and kind of have a routine, because this instrument, like, we can't touch it. And it's also so much about our feelings and our mood and all that. So it's really abstract. For the practice, I think that there are different aspects. So, of course, we practice on technique. So the voice itself, like how the resonance places work and breathing and how to project the sound, how to get as much space as possible in our resonance cavity and all that. Have a nice sound and explore different sounds. At the same time, there's also like the ear part, learning a certain kind of melodic language. In jazz, we do a lot of transcriptions, so try to learn like a solo by a saxophone or something like that. And then on top of that, there's also repertoire, of course, learning songs, and different people have different methods. Some people do really ear-based, like they learn everything by ear and they don't read much. For some people, they really try to get good at sight reading for instruments like us who don't have buttons to press on.
I appreciate that insight. And again, because it all happened so quickly for you, I'm intrigued by the process specifically as you went through it. The learning of the technique and the methodology while also discovering your voice, while also being a music student in such an intensive way for the first time. It's intriguing to me.
I broke into the nation dream of humanity as I entered an ocean of palm trees.
You also mentioned how, as you shifted throughout the programs, performance became a bigger part of what you were looking to do and what you were able to do. Can you talk a little bit about what are the opportunities available in a city like Montreal? Like, what was there for you? Is there a vibrant scene? Were there opportunities to be on stage?
I would say there's a pretty nice and diverse scene in Montreal. As part of the school, there's a lot of performances at the halls at school. And McGill has a collaboration with a very prestigious jazz bar called Upstairs.
Oh, okay.
There is like a night every week. I remember for me, it was Tuesday nights where the student bands get to perform. Each band gets maybe 2 performances each semester at the bar. I know there's a pretty big hip-hop scene and like French pop scene, but I don't really know about that because I think that's not the music that I'm particularly drawn into. But there's also a nice experimental music scene. There are a few venues and an organization called Zhuani that's really community-based, and they focus on creative music and experimental music.
Something I've observed in my conversations, especially over the last 6 to 12 months with artists around the world, is that there does seem to be quite an emerging movement at the local and regional levels in various parts of North America and Europe, at least, around this sort of intersection of electroacoustic music, improvised music, jazz, electronics. I guess what we would maybe broadly call experimental. But it's a very exciting moment in the independent music world where sort of academia is meeting clubs, I guess. It's kind of interesting. Really trained, proficient people doing very exciting. It sort of reminds me a lot of the late 60s, early 70s, what the minimalists came out of, that sort of training plus improvisation. Does that resonate for you at all? Do you witness that?
I think there are different types of musicians in each city and coming from each school. And there's always this group of musicians who's interested in pushing the music forward and doing like experimental stuff. And I think it's a natural tendency for a lot of us because we all grew up and a lot of us grew up listening to all kinds of music. So as a musician or artist ourselves, where do we stand in this? And so it's really nice to have kind of a space and stage to explore new sounds and be experimental. I see that in Montreal, and there is a very nice creative new music community in Bern, Switzerland here as well. In a way, that community is maybe more prominent because the school here, it's an art school itself and like not that much of a jazz tradition. Because in Montreal, a lot of people play like really straight ahead jazz and they really focus on passing on a tradition, which makes sense if that music is what they listened to growing up. But yeah, for a lot of people, we are interested in all kinds of things and like social topics as well. And so I think in experimental music and like free improvisation, there's a lot of space for us to express ourselves.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On right after this break. If you're interested in contributing to bonus tracks, the official blog of this podcast, visit spotlightonpodcast.com and click Call for Submissions. That's where we post details on what we're currently looking for and how to be considered. And now, back to Spotlight On. Could you talk a little bit about the role of, I guess broadly speaking, like social topics and the importance of having an all-female ensemble? I guess the idea, like the social issues, but the notion of representation, like how are these things manifesting in your work, if at all?
I think it does. It's never something I try really hard to push, but somehow they just happen because of every little choice I make. For example, the band I had for my album, that's all female, but initially I didn't have that intention at all. I just came across all those wonderful female musicians. Like, I love playing with all of them. And it's not because they're female, it's just because of who they are. And at last, I had an all-female lineup. And of course, I know in jazz, the gender representation is a lot of the time not that equal. So I was like, wow, this is awesome. And I like this energy. This is not what I usually come across, but this is what I have now. And it's nice. For my other music too, I found sometimes it's nice to be a little bit political in my music, and I try to be really careful with it, and I'm never like, oh, I'm gonna write this piece about feminism or things like that. It just all comes and evolves as I live my life and talk to people. And sometimes I would be like, oh, what if I just add a little spoken word in this song? Sounds like it could be about that issue, and I want to speak a little bit about it.
Do you have any sense of how your record, how the latest album, it's very hard to believe how distinct and fully formed your voice is, knowing this part of your biography about how much of your development has only happened in the last few years. It's a stunning, stunning record and a beautiful use of voice. Congratulations on that. Do you have any sense for how the album has been received in China? Do you know if it's been able to find any audience there?
I have no idea because I actually didn't put it on in China. There are streaming services in China, and I just haven't found the time to deal with that and upload the music and go through like the copyright process. So I actually do not know. You know, in China, YouTube and Bandcamp and Spotify and all that was not available.
I'm curious, do you have any sense that any of the themes or the lyrical content would present problems?
That's a good question, and I know what you're asking about, but with this album, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Were you present for the sessions with the Craft Ensemble? Were you able to attend?
Yeah, I went to Boston for that.
Could you talk about that experience a little bit?
Okay, so it was after my recording session with the Montreal Jazz Trio, and I flew to Boston about a week later, and I met them in person for the first time. We only met in Zoom before. It was just really nice. They were all really open. Before the recording session, I did like a quarter note based meditative exercise for an hour. I was like in a really nice, good state going into the studio with them. And it wasn't a lot of pressure for me because I was not singing on most of them. They were overdubbing on the tracks, but I did sing with them on one of the tracks. And one of the band members was able to see me through the window of the voice room. It's a half rubato piece, so I was like half conducting them and breathing together with them. I can tell it's an ensemble that has been playing together for a long time, and they each have a nice relationship with each other. So it's just a really nice and warm recording session with them.
What did you bring? Did you bring charts and scores, or how does that work when you're integrating an ensemble like that?
I brought them the scores. So they each have the scores for the string section. They didn't have what the piano and bass drums are doing, but they know what each other is doing from their scores. And I sent that to them before the session, and we had a Zoom rehearsal where they play through the music, and there was a little bit of organization because they were overdubbing, so they need to know when they need to play. And sometimes I have to conduct them so that they can feel the time better, because classical and jazz, like the music works very differently, and the musicians feel the time and pulse very differently. They just each had the string scores, and they were reading off their iPads.
That's really an incredible experience to be able to lead the ensemble that way. And what an incredibly rich experience throughout that whole process of making that record. I mean, there's so many traditions integrated in a very seamless way, just even and reflected even in the melody, never mind the composition and arrangement. It's just a wonderful achievement. Could you tell me a little bit about the compositions themselves? Did you compose knowing you were creating an album, or were these pieces that, rather than speculate, could you just talk a little bit about how the compositional process and intention came together?
Now I think about albums a lot when I write music, but back then it wasn't. It was pieces that I've been writing in maybe 1 or 2 years prior to that. Over time, I just had a collection of pieces that seemed to work well together, and I personally liked and have performed with mostly like a jazz trio in public. I think it was like on a bike ride in the summer in Montreal, and I just started hearing strings on one of my pieces. I started brainstorming, oh, what if I really do it? And then I brought it up to my teacher, who's also my producer, Ayelet, and she's like, oh, this is an awesome idea, and I think we should really do it. And that's how it came about. So I spent months and a year or two slowly writing the pieces without the intention of making an album. Maybe the 3 months before I recorded it, that was like the writing and arranging period where I wrote all the strings.
When the roof tiles blow away from the house of language, and words no longer that is when I speak. The ladies in red have lost themselves in their masks.
How was Craft Ensemble chosen? How was that string section chosen?
Actually, the viola player, Amelia, in Craft Ensemble went to school together with my teacher, Ayelet. Ayelet recommended the ensemble to me, and I went to listen to them. They have a beautiful sound, so I decided to go with them.
You mentioned the meditation you did before the session. Could you talk a little bit about that practice and what a quarter note meditation is and what role that practice plays in your artistic life?
It's an exercise I got from a teacher I had at McGill. His name is John Hollenbeck. He's a drummer, percussionist, and he has this famous quarter note exercise, and he has a seminar at McGill about this exercise. Basically, any instrument we play really slow quarter notes, mostly with a metronome, and we subdivide each beat. In this case, we mostly use the subdivision of 9, and we have different variations of this exercise, and there's a basic form where we just play a short quarter note with our instrument, and then the metronome, which would be about like 20 to 30 beats per minute, that plays on the 5th subdivision of each beat. And we just do that for however long. And usually I do that as the first thing of my practice, as a centering and waking up my brain, and it's very meditative. So on that day, actually, I was supposed to be at school at McGill for the last class of the semester, where we played the basic exercise together as the group for an hour. And I wasn't able to attend the class because of the recording session. So I asked John, what should I do? I really don't want to miss it. And he said, well, you can do it on your own. So I did it for an hour. I didn't know what effect it would have, but during that hour, I was getting really aware of all the parts of my body and my own voice in a good way, like body awareness, and it just calmed me down so much. And I felt I was in a much more peaceful state, and I was able to accept a lot more things in general after that an hour.
My understanding from reading a bit about you is that you've also had a practice or some work around the deep listening sort of modality. That's something I've only become acquainted with in the last maybe 9 months or so, as I've learned more about Pauline, who I always knew her name, but I was not as familiar with her work until much more recent. Could you talk a little bit about that tradition?
I took a deep listening course online with the Deep Listening Institutes that Pauline created. It's a long-term course, and it's divided into different stages. I heard about Pauline at school, and I just got interested, so I looked her up, and I was really amazed. Like, there's an institute for listening. Oh my God, that's so cool. And then I signed up for their mailing list, and finally there's a spot for the class. So I took it for like 3 months. And over the 3 months of the course, me and other students around the world, we meet every week and we have exercises in between. And the first month was about listening, and the second month about listening in movement. And the third month, it was about listening and dreaming. Yeah, there's so much about it I can talk about. And it did change just the way I live my daily life. An important notion is to remember to listen.
What is the benefit of remembering to listen? Or maybe I can ask it a different way. Why should one want to remember to listen?
My answer, a simple answer that I personally have to that is just, it feels good. Often when I walk on the street and we hear things all the time, everywhere, but we don't pay attention to them necessarily most of the time, I think. But just the notion of remember to listen. When I walk on the street, for example, remember to listen to my surroundings, and sometimes noise, cars driving by. I feel if I don't remember to listen to them, they're just like background noises that kind of drowns into my subconscious, and maybe they make me more irritable or grumpy. But when I pay attention to them and be open and be curious and even non-judgmental, they become sounds and interesting things I can be curious about.
Yeah, I can imagine, even as maybe mundane as you can hear rhythm in construction sites or melody coming from a passing train or whatever it may be that you're hearing, those are all the sort of transition of noise to sound to music is an interesting continuum.
But even not that interesting, just like boring things. Or in my room right now, there's a low humming that I might just not notice at all. But when I start to listen to it, it's like, oh, wait, there's a sound. What about this sound? What does it sound like? What are the characteristics of it? And then I start to slow down and breathe.
Do those sounds today, or do you see a future where that all makes its way into your music?
Always, not necessarily, but they always come into my consciousness and they could be a source of inspiration. Yeah, because now I'm thinking about just taking field recordings and add them music or kind of orchestrate a soundscape, that kind of thing. Of course, that's a possibility, and I'm interested in doing that. And also just by listening more, even in normal playing, you start noticing all the nuanced difference in the way people play their instrument. And I think when our awareness to sound is on that level, there's a lot in what's already there.
One of the other things that I read about you is that you still teach other musicians, other artists. Maybe I read it on your website when I was preparing. One of the offerings that you had was artistic development. What does that mean? Is that how someone finds their voice? Is it mentorship? What does that mean in the context of sort of being a pedagogue? What is artistic development?
It's along the line of what you mentioned. And I think each person is unique. Most of my students aren't professional musicians or artists, but I believe the artistry in each of them. And I think each of them have the potential to create the music and artwork that's their own. So I really respect that, and I really try to figure out what this person in front of me is like, and what would they do if they have enough confidence to create their own music and art vision. I think that's what I mean, and I try really to understand what my student is like as a human and overall. And it's not just about learning a style or try to execute certain things really well.
For your work, where are you going next? Do you have the vision yet? Have you started work?
Yeah, I just moved to Switzerland, so that's really exciting. I'm meeting a lot of new people and getting to know the scene here, which I'm really happy about. I've been writing a lot currently for different ensembles and for the new musicians I met. Now I have 2 trios that we are already starting to build repertoires and new music. I actually just came from a rehearsal. I'm at school and it's a trio with myself on voice and an electric bass player and a drummer. Yeah, I'm gonna try to keep writing music and performing with these small groups, and at the same time I want to do some larger projects with maybe a jazz orchestra or maybe more like a classical music ensemble setting. And I'd like to conduct my own pieces. I see a lot of possibilities at this school, so I want to do some interdisciplinary stuff. I go back to China from time to time in my vacations, so every time I go back, I try to connect with the traditional musicians there. So that's a long-term, ongoing research that I'm doing.
Have you done any studies, any formal studies in that tradition?
No, not yet. I don't have a musical upbringing, so nobody in my family does a lot of music. So I don't have the chance, and I'm trying to find teachers to study with back home.
It's very interesting, the vocal trio and the sort of absence of another harmonic instrument, no piano. It's bold. It's a very bare presentation. What's attractive to you about that format?
First of all, I like the musicians, and it happens to be voice, bass, and drums. And I think I always like challenges. And as a vocalist, I want to, of course, be a good vocalist, but also the other instruments. What can I do to do like things that trumpet players or saxophone players can do? Can I try to do some drum things maybe? So it's really fun when it's not that conventional instrumentation, and it leaves a lot of room for exploring things.
I'm so looking forward to hearing more work from you, and I hope as you develop more projects that you'll come back and talk about them. I look forward to many years of interesting music from you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ray-Chee Wong. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host and executive producer, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and edited by Michael Donaldson, with theme music by Q Bern's Abstract Message. If you'd like to support our work, please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, or visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive of over 200 episodes, weekly postings on our official blog, and a ton more. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.